So what we've done tonight is we've travelled around, and what we want to emphasise to you, there's a lot of different options out there, and many of them are non-commercial and not-for-profit, and there's opportunities for that. And also we've shown that New Zealand can be bold and innovative, and we don't have to sleepwalk towards an alcohol-style market. But the question that comes up as you look at the popular polling for the referendum and whether people support the referendum and the legalisation of cannabis is recently they're starting to look not so positive. So the question that comes out of that, if we go to the referendum and the referendum fails, what other opportunities are there for compromise and for a new approach? And we have a really good examples in Australia of those kind of decriminalisation approaches. And Simon Lenton here, Professor Simon Lenton from Western Australia, is one of the best people to talk about that because he's really lived those changes and he can tell us how successful they were.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah.
Hi from across the ditch. Marta's presented data on a model which is yet to be implemented, which I think is fantastic. I'm going the other extreme, and a lot of the data that I'm going to be presenting is almost history, because we've had these models in place for quite a long time. We haven't done a lot of recent work on their impact, but we've got some previous work that I'm going to be sharing with you, and I hope to finish this quickly, because I know you've been sitting there and have got questions to ask. We want to give you as much time as possible. I just want to forecast that we're going to keep the doors open after 8 o'clock. I hope there'll be discussion. I hope you don't mind hanging around for that. Okay, so Australia has had prohibition with civil penalties, infringement notices in 3. There was 4 jurisdictions. Mine in red there. We did a lot of work that led to the decriminalisation of cannabis in Western Australia under the Labor government that was elected in 2002. It got overturned when the Libs went back in. They didn't get back in because of the cannabis law changes, but they overturned it in 2008, although they didn't formally roll it back until 2011. But you can see the South Australian scheme was implemented back in the mid-80s, and we did a lot of work around evaluating the impact of that scheme along with other colleagues. You can see in the other states and territories we had prohibition with cautioning. So I'll describe those 2 models in a minute, and we'll talk about what some of the impacts that we know about them. The most recent thing that's happened is that in the ACT, they've just passed a bill to legalise cannabis in the ACT. It'll come into effect early in the new year, but it's a pretty modest proposal. It legalises less than 50 grams of dry cannabis, up to 2 plants per person, a maximum of 4 plants per household. But it's in conflict with Commonwealth laws. There's a worry about whether it'll be rolled over by the feds. Probably won't, but that's a risk. They've banned artificial cultivation, which is a bit of a problem in Canberra because it's pretty damn cold. I don't know how plants are going to grow outside because they've used artificial light as the defining characteristic, and we'll talk a bit about that later on, so that's a problem. They haven't allowed gifting, and so you know, it's a very modest proposal. It's got a lot of problems with it, but at least it's the first proposal for legalised cannabis that's got through legislation in Australia. So we're all pretty familiar with the full prohibition with criminal penalties model. We know how it works. People who claim it has some advantages say that it's consistent with the international drug treaties and that it gives us a clear, unambiguous message against drugs. But there's a lot of disadvantages that we all know about. The evidence is that specific deterrent effects is weak. That is, if you look at cannabis users' use of cannabis in the 6 months before they're busted and look at their use in the 6 months after they're busted, guess what? It doesn't look very different, okay? So even when people are busted, it doesn't actually affect their cannabis use very much. Sure, some people do change, but overall not very big changes, and people tend to return to the use that they had beforehand. So even if you thought that criminalisation is good because it stops people from using cannabis, the evidence actually doesn't support that. And of course there's lots of individual and social harms that come from getting a criminal record, and we'll talk about that in a minute too. It's a very economically expensive thing to police, and there's all sorts of harms from applying criminal penalties to people which don't usually get counted. Prohibition with cautioning or diversion, you kind of have these schemes in here. People get, at some point in the process, get asked to attend a treatment or an education session in lieu of getting a criminal penalty. And the advantages are that, you know, it does keep some people from getting a criminal penalty, cops really like it because they like to have options to give people, and some cannabis users might actually get to treatment who might otherwise not get to treatment, and Bo referred to that in his stuff in the US. But there are lots of disadvantages, primarily that it only applies to very small offences. There are many exclusions, such as if you've got a prior conviction, you get excluded. And so some of the people that might most benefit from treatment don't actually get it because they've got prior offences and they get excluded. And the way it's implemented can result in net widening, so increase in overall offences and reduced use of informal warnings by police. And, you've got to ask yourself, is it the best use of valuable treatment resources to be forcing people to go to treatment who might not have a cannabis use disorder and might not want treatment? Is that what we should be doing? I think it isn't, but that's in place in lots of places. And, of course, it doesn't deal with the supply side, which all the other models that we've heard about do. So, prohibition with civil penalties. It's no worse than strict prohibition at deterring use. So it remains illegal, but it's much like speeding in a motor car. If you get busted, you get a fine. If you pay that fine within a certain period of time, then you don't get a conviction. And we know that the social costs of infringement are far less than conviction, and that it's cheaper than prohibition. The disadvantages are that we get the net widening again. If it's easy for police to issue notices, lots of them get written. It can disadvantage people who can't pay the fines. They can end up getting criminalised. Police can really distort its effects, and that's a problem. The proportion of fines actually paid can be quite low, and most people will choose not to grow their own cannabis. The estimates we've had are that at most 30% of regular cannabis users will grow most of the cannabis that they smoke. So what do you do about the other 70% of people that are regular cannabis users? Where do they get their cannabis from? Here's some work that we did on the South Australian and civil penalty scheme, comparing it to Western Australia, looking at the impacts of a conviction. We had matched cannabis users in each group, matched for age, matched for years of using cannabis, matched for the duration of time since they were busted. And guess what? Getting a criminal conviction has much greater impacts on employment, relationships, accommodation, further involvement with the criminal justice system and travel. So when we did that work on South Australia, we found that changing the law from a criminal penalty scheme to a civil penalty scheme didn't result in great increases in numbers of regular cannabis users. In fact, neither a criminal conviction or a civil penalty actually had much impact on people's cannabis use, but the social costs of conviction were far greater. Police were supportive, judiciary was supportive, the public was supportive, and there was some criminal justice savings. This is just data, fresh data, looking at the Australian scheme. So here's the South Australian scheme now. I just want you to look at this column. How these schemes impact depends on how they're implemented. And at the moment, 83% of all people busted for a cannabis offence in South Australia get an infringement notice. Only 16% get a conviction for all cannabis offences, whereas in the ACT, it's similar. It's a decriminalised scheme, but 82% of people busted get a criminal conviction and 17% get an infringement notice. Now, I think that's because actually in South Australia, cops will give people an informal warning rather than giving them one of these notices. And you can see that in Western Australia, we've gone back to prohibition with cautioning, and you can see again that most people are getting criminal convictions rather than getting a civil penalty. But look, evidence is crucially important. We all do drug policy research. We're all about evidence. But when we were designing the scheme that went into place in WA in 2004 to 2007, we thought that these other matters are at least as important as what the evidence says. And I think when you're thinking about a scheme for New Zealand, you need to think about what's publicly sellable, what can politicians survive, what's supported by the cops, what's supported by cannabis users. Yeah, evidence is important. And we need to evaluate and review what we're doing. So the cannabis infringement notice scheme that we had in place in WA was sort of typical of them. Under 30 grams, you got an infringement notice. Up to 2 non-hydro plants, and the hydroponic plants were excluded by basically by police, and there's health concerns. We'll come back to those and having a used implement. Had 28 days to pay the fine, or they could do an education session in lieu of paying a fine. That was intended to not criminalise people who couldn't afford to pay the fines. It wasn't intended to be the big public health education in the community around cannabis, because only 3% of people who use cannabis in any one year ever get busted by police. So if you're doing public education, cannabis users are important, but there's a whole lot of other people that don't get busted. and there was a whole lot of stuff done, including regulating of head shops, which is important. Dealing thresholds were made more severe, and there was regulation of head shops. So what happened? Well, over a 3-year period, there were just under 10,000 notices issued to about 7,000 individuals, mostly on one occasion, mostly were due to possession of small amounts, not very much due to cultivation, mostly young men. And importantly, again, we had racial disparity with increasing proportion of Indigenous people getting issued notices disproportionate to the population. And it's the same with lots of offending in the community, lots of the way criminal justice operates. It's a problem for this scheme, it's a problem for lots of other schemes. Here's what happened when the scheme was implemented. This is the 6 years beforehand, and this is the 6 years afterwards. 3 years before and 3 years afterwards. And what you see is that when the scheme was implemented, the number of convictions went down, but actually over time convictions went up and the number of notices went down. Police got jack of it because it was implemented just after September 11, when police, one of the approaches to preventing terrorism was to sweep as many people up, get as much information on them as you can. So instead of issuing notices in the street, they brought people back to the station, they photographed them, they fingerprinted them, and they gave them their notice. And guess what? Police got jack of that because it was easier for them to give them a criminal conviction. And we got this net widening, so overall the number of people caught up in the criminal justice system went up, and that's not a good outcome. In terms of paying people's fines, overall 65 to 75% of people actually expiated their notices, but only 10% of Indigenous CINS were expiated. I won't go into all this stuff, except to say that only 13% did an education session. I thought that was a good outcome. It wasn't about educating the community, and those people avoided getting their fine by choosing to do the education. So in the 3 years that the scheme was in place, about 2,500 people who previously didn't have a criminal record avoided getting their first criminal charge for their minor cannabis offence. There were lots of other people who had priors who also got an infringement notice, but they already had a criminal conviction. Let me skip that. And there was some criminal justice savings, not a huge amount, but there was some criminal justice savings over a criminal scheme. So we saw no increases in use over the first 3 years. This is ever use, this is use in the last 12 months. And here's the data on use in WA matched to the national figures. The scheme stopped here. There was a bit of an increase in self-reported use here. We don't know whether that was to do with decreased stigma, people willing to self-report. Maybe there was an increase in use. We don't know whether that would have continued if the scheme had continued. But at any rate, the scheme was turned over and the use rates went down and started to trend the way they had been previously. Importantly, we didn't see any softening of attitudes towards cannabis as a result, which is one of the things that opponents of the scheme thought. They thought people would start to see it as safe and so on. No evidence that happened. And we saw levels of support dropped in the first 3 years the scheme was in place, but still remained at least 2/3 of people thinking the scheme was a good idea. And even among Conservative voters, 60% of Conservative voters still thought the scheme was a good idea. We did see reductions in youth, in high school cannabis use, which continued after the scheme was implemented. We don't know what would have happened after that. These are just trend data. There's no control group, so there's that issue. I'm not going to address this. We'll talk about this in the questions if you have any. But one thing I would say is we've done some work, Tom and I and others have done work on surveying 6,500 cannabis users in 11 countries. We're about to redo that survey, and we asked people in Australia, in the UK and in Denmark about their growing practices. And what we found was that 41% of people said they used artificial nutrients and so on, particularly in their hydro setups. And for those of you that know about growing cannabis, you'll know that one of the concerns is about the use of plant growth regulators, which are chemicals that were banned in agriculture many years ago, but they're still used in the flower industry, and they produce small plants with lots of flowers. So you see those photos on the internet of, buds that are that big. Buds that big don't generally come from natural production. They come from chemical...
Biodynamics.
Sorry?
Biodynamics.
Yeah, biodynamics can go close, right, yeah. But you know the ones I mean, that they need a wheelbarrow to kind of cart, right? So, and the concern is that, people have been putting this stuff on their cannabis crops, on the crops that we've been smoking for the last 20 plus years, and what's on the bottle doesn't reflect what's in the bottle. So there's a real issue there. It's a real public health issue. I think cannabis users and cannabis growers have a right to know what chemicals they're putting into their body, and so do my kids who might be smoking cannabis might need to know that. I think we need to regulate this industry. It's a multi-million-dollar industry. It's international. People buy stuff online and through head shops. We need to know what's in this stuff that people are putting on their cannabis plants. I think if you're looking at cannabis regulation, there's a missed opportunity if you don't address this issue. Thank you for your time.
Yep, thank you.